From revolution emerged a new state. Red banners reshaped 20th century history, an experiment born from collapse empire. Power promised equality control simultaneously globally. World's first socialist state appeared officially. Ideology replaced monarchy capitalism overnight everywhere. Workers' peasants became political symbols nationwide. The state redefined power ownership structures. Formally founded 1922 period. Union-bound republics under center authority. Borders expanded through ideology security doctrine. A centralized vision controlled diversity tightly. It covered Eastern Europe, Central Asia. Vast landmass challenged administration logistics continually. Different cultures, languages lived together uneasily. Unity enforced through party structure nationwide. The Soviet Union became superpower status. Military science industry advanced rapidly statewide. Nuclear parity defined global fear balance. Power measured against American influence constantly. Cold War framed every decision globally. Ideological battle replaced direct conflict worldwide. Alliances formed, proxy wars erupted frequently. World politics split into camps hostile. Central planning guided economy production nationwide. 5-year plans drove growth targets. Subscribe now to uncover untold historical events. Witness the past come alive through narration. Learn, wonder, and travel across time vividly. Every story brings history to life dramatically. The Russian Empire entered the 20th century, carrying centuries of absolute imperial rule. Power rested firmly with the Tsar alone. Change was feared more than failure. Society remained deeply divided by rigid classes. Nobles lived in luxury and privilege. Peasants struggled under crushing poverty. Inequality shaped everyday imperial life. Industrialization arrived late and unevenly. Factories grew without proper worker protections. Urban laborers faced long, brutal hours. Discontent quietly spread across cities. Political reform was repeatedly delayed. Autocracy resisted constitutional limits. Dissent was suppressed by secret police. Fear replaced trust between ruler and people. The Russo-Japanese War exposed imperial weakness. Military defeat shocked the population. Faith in Tsarist leadership weakened. Authority began visibly cracking. Revolutionary ideas circulated through underground movements. Marxist thinkers inspired radical alternatives. Workers organized strikes across industries. The empire struggled to contain unrest. World War I intensified every existing problem. Russia entered unprepared and under-equipped. Millions of soldiers faced shortages. Morale collapsed on distant battlefields. Economic strain devastated civilian life. Food shortages struck major cities. Inflation erased workers' wages. Hunger fueled growing resentment. That Tsar assumed direct military command. Leadership at home weakened further. Government coordination collapsed rapidly. Chaos replaced centralized imperial control. Public protests escalated into mass demonstrations. Workers demanded bread and peace. Soldiers refused orders to fire. Loyalty to the crown vanished. The February Revolution erupted suddenly. Petrograd streets filled with protesters. Authority slipped beyond imperial recovery. The old order unraveled completely. Nicholas II abdicated the throne. 3 centuries of Romanov rule ended. Imperial institutions lost legitimacy overnight. Russia stood leaderless and unstable. A provisional government struggled to govern. It inherited war, hunger, unrest. Promises of reform came too late. Public confidence rapidly evaporated. Power drifted toward workers' councils. Dual authority confused national direction. Imperial collapse created political vacuum. Revolutionary forces prepared to rise. The Russian Empire officially ceased existing. Its collapse reshaped Eurasian history. Old loyalties dissolved into uncertainty. A new era waited to begin. Russia in 1917 stood exhausted and fractured. War drained resources and shattered morale. Cities pulsed with anger and desperation. Hope for peace faded quickly. The provisional government failed expectations. It continued the unpopular World War. Land reforms were endlessly postponed. Public trust eroded with each delay. Workers demanded bread, wages, dignity. Soldiers demanded peace and survival. Peasants demanded land ownership. No demand received clear answers. Soviets gained influence across major cities. Workers' councils organized strikes and protests. Their authority rivaled the government. Dual power defined revolutionary tension. Soviets gained influence across major cities. Workers' councils organized strikes and protests. Their authority rivaled the government. Dual power defined revolutionary tension. Bolsheviks promised radical immediate change. Their slogans were simple and powerful. Peace, land, and bread resonated deeply. Masses began listening closely. Vladimir Lenin returned from exile. His presence energized revolutionary momentum. He called for total power transfer. Moderation was firmly rejected. The Bolsheviks rejected gradual reform. They demanded immediate socialist transformation. Capitalism was labeled the enemy. Revolution became unavoidable. Petrograd became the revolution's center. Factories shut down in protest. Armed workers formed Red Guards. Authority slipped further each day. The October uprising was carefully planned. Bolshevik leaders coordinated decisive action. Key infrastructure was quietly seized. Resistance proved surprisingly weak. The Winter Palace was stormed. Provisional leaders were arrested swiftly. Government control collapsed overnight. Power shifted without prolonged bloodshed. The Bolsheviks declared a new authority. Soviet power replaced parliamentary governance. Decrees promised land redistribution. Peace negotiations were announced immediately. Opposition parties were marginalized rapidly. Political pluralism disappeared quickly. Revolution justified extraordinary measures. Dissent was labeled counter-revolutionary. Russia withdrew from World War I. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk followed. Territorial losses shocked former allies. Peace came at high cost. The revolution reshaped global ideology. Socialism moved from theory to reality. Fear and inspiration spread worldwide. A new political era began. The Bolshevik Revolution secured power. Yet stability remained distant and fragile. Civil war loomed ahead. The struggle had only begun. Vladimir Lenin returned from exile determined. He sought to overthrow the old order. His words inspired millions across Russia. Revolution became his singular purpose. Lenin emphasized strict party discipline. Bolsheviks were trained to obey completely. Unity was crucial for revolutionary success. Factionalism was not tolerated under Lenin. He prioritized proletarian leadership over compromise. The working class had to lead. Peasant support was necessary, but secondary. The state served socialist objectives. Lenin adapted Marxism to Russian conditions. Industrial backwardness required pragmatic solutions. Revolution did not wait for perfection. Change demanded swift, decisive action. He led through speeches and writings. Pamphlets spread throughout the empire quickly. Ideas of peace and land reform resonated. Popular support grew steadily each day. Lenin directed key strategic decisions personally. Military operations and governance fell under him. Red Guards acted on his orders. Civil war strategy was meticulously planned. He introduced policies to consolidate power. War communism regulated industry strictly. Resources were centralized under state control. Opposition faced immediate suppression. Lenin reorganized government structures efficiently. Soviets became instruments of central authority. Local councils reported to Moscow directly. State power became highly centralized. He negotiated critical treaties internationally. Peace with Germany relieved military pressure. Diplomacy balanced war and revolution demands. Foreign intervention was carefully managed. Lenin faced constant internal challenges. Factional struggles tested his leadership daily. He crushed dissent decisively, but subtly. Authority remained unchallenged within party ranks. He emphasized ideology alongside practicality. Education in Marxist thought was vital. Propaganda spread revolutionary principles widely. Public morale remained carefully guided. Lenin's health declined, but influence persisted. Decisions continued, despite physical weakness. Power structures outlasted personal limitations. His vision shaped Soviet foundations permanently. Leadership was both feared and respected. His charisma inspired loyalty across factions. Soviet institutions reflected his political philosophy. Change under Lenin was total and swift. Lenin's death left a monumental legacy. The USSR retained his organizational blueprint. Power struggles emerged after his passing, yet his revolutionary path remained central. Civil war erupted across war-weary Russia. Red Bolsheviks faced white opposition forces. Chaos spread through towns and countryside. Violence became widespread and relentless. Both sides fought for total control. Alliances shifted unpredictably in regions. Foreign powers intervened to influence outcomes. Support arrived for anti-Bolshevik armies. The Reds defended cities fiercely. Factories and railways became battle zones. Urban centers suffered extreme shortages. Civilians endured hunger and fear. The White Armies lacked unity. Regional commanders pursued personal agendas. Coordination failures weakened their campaigns. Victory slipped repeatedly from their hands. The Red Army was disciplined and organized. Troops followed strict hierarchical commands. Lenin emphasized loyalty above all. Ideological commitment strengthened their resolve. Propaganda motivated soldiers and citizens alike. Newspapers, posters, and speeches rallied support. Revolutionary ideals inspired continuous effort. Morale became a crucial battlefield weapon. Peasant uprisings complicated war efforts. Some opposed both Reds and Whites. Local resistance challenged all military forces. Control was never absolute in regions. Red Terror enforced strict political control. Counter-revolutionary were punished without mercy. Fear maintained Bolshevik dominance locally. Power was consolidated ruthlessly and effectively. War communism supplied Red Army efficiently. Resources were seized from reluctant peasants. Centralized distribution supported military campaigns. Economic policy became survival strategy. Key battles decided strategic outcomes quickly. Moscow and Petrograd remained under Bolsheviks. Front lines shifted violently yet unpredictably. Victory required both strategy and luck. The Civil War devastated Russian society. Millions died from combat and famine. Infrastructure was destroyed across regions. Recovery would take years to begin. By 1921, Bolsheviks emerged victorious finally. White forces fragmented or fled abroad. Red control extended over former empire territories. The Soviet states became secure. Civil war forged the Soviet regime. Ideological unity outweighed regional loyalties. Power was centralized firmly in Moscow. The USSR's foundation had been solidified. In 1922, a new state emerged. Former Russian territories united under one. The USSR was officially proclaimed. Unity aimed to strengthen socialist rule. For Soviet republics formed the Federation. Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Transcaucasia united. Each republic retained limited autonomy. Central authority remained firmly in Moscow. The constitution codified governance structures clearly. Supreme Soviet became the highest legislative body. Communist Party dominated all key decisions. Democratic forms existed mostly on paper. Economic centralization strengthened national control. State-directed industry, agriculture, and trade. 5-year plans would follow later. Industrialization became a primary objective. National identity shifted towards socialist ideals. Propaganda emphasized unity over regionalism. Education promoted communist ideology thoroughly. Culture was reshaped to serve the state. Military reorganization protected fragile sovereignty. The Red Army absorbed former factions. Border defenses were reinforced heavily. External threats required constant vigilance. Political opposition was systematically eliminated. Non-Bolshevik parties were banned quickly. Dissent faced arrests or exile. Control over information became absolute. Diplomatic relations were cautiously established abroad. The USSR sought recognition from foreign powers. Trade agreements followed strategic interests carefully. Isolationism was balanced with selective engagement. National resources were reorganized efficiently. Land and industry were redistributed centrally. Collectivization began planning on rural lands. Agriculture became state-managed for surplus. Cultural transformation supported ideological consolidation. Art, literature, and media reflected socialist values. Education focused on technical and political training. Youth organizations molded future citizens. The formation marked historic transformation. Empire became federation, with revolutionary foundations. Old Russian monarchy was fully replaced. Soviet ideology guided all national policies. By 1922, the USSR stood unified. Internal conflict gradually subsided under control. Power was centralized, authority unquestioned. The stage was set for future expansion. The Soviet Union's creation redefined Eurasia. History entered a new revolutionary chapter. A state emerged from turmoil and war. Its influence would span decades profoundly. The Soviet Union established a single-party system. No alternative parties were legally permitted. All power was concentrated under communists. Democracy existed only in official name. The Communist Party controlled government institutions. Elections offered no genuine political choice. Candidates were pre-approved by party officials. Voters could not challenge authority. The state claimed to represent working class. Proletariat ideology justified absolute control. All laws reflected party objectives directly. Opposition was framed as counter-revolutionary activity. Local Soviets existed, but under oversight. Decision-making followed central directives strictly. Autonomy was limited in every region. Communist leadership dictated administrative functions. The one-party system ensured ideological conformity. Dissenting voices were systematically silenced. Propaganda reinforced party-approved beliefs continually. Education taught loyalty above independent thought. Media, press, and publications were state-owned. Only approved viewpoints reached the population. Censorship prevented spread of alternative ideas. Art and literature supported official ideology. The legal system enforced party supremacy strictly. Courts rarely acted independently of party. Judicial decisions reinforced political objectives. Punishments for opposition were often severe. The one-party system survived internal challenges. Factional disputes were resolved within party. Power struggles never threatened overall monopoly. Authority remained firmly in communist hands. Society adapted to centralized political structure. People learned to navigate official hierarchies. Compliance was often necessary for survival. Political life revolved around party loyalty. State institutions reflected party priorities exclusively. Government bureaucracy mirrored ideological requirements closely. Efficiency was secondary to political control. Centralized planning dominated public administration. By creating a single-party system, the USSR aimed for total social transformation. Political pluralism disappeared completely and permanently. Party authority defined every aspect of life. The Communist Party controlled every state function. All government branches answered to its leadership. Policy, economy, and military followed directives. No decision occurred without party approval. Party membership was crucial for advancement. Officials gained influence through loyalty, not merit. Education and career paths favored members exclusively. Opportunity was tied directly to party obedience. Ideology guided all major national decisions. Economic plans reflected Marxist-Leninist principles. Industrialization and collectivization followed party objectives. Individual interests were subordinate to state goals. The party monitored citizens constantly. KGB and local committees tracked compliance closely. Surveillance reinforced political and social control. Fear ensured loyalty throughout the population. Propaganda emphasized the party as supreme. Media, literature, and arts glorified its rule. History was rewritten to support authority. Education taught unquestioned loyalty from youth. Internal party structures determined promotions. Factional disputes were resolved internally. Political purges removed potential rivals ruthlessly. Obedience was rewarded, dissent punished swiftly. The party directed foreign and domestic policy. All treaties, trade, and diplomacy reflected ideology. Strategic interests were prioritized over consensus. Centralized leadership maintained absolute control. Mass organizations reinforced party influence daily. Youth leagues, labor unions, and cooperatives operated under guidance. Participation taught conformity and ideological alignment. Society became an extension of party governance. Election processes were controlled completely. Candidates reflected party priorities exclusively. Voter choice was largely symbolic. Political power remained unchallenged within the state. The Communist Party shaped national identity. Loyalty and ideology defined citizen behavior. Cultural and social norms reflected political goals. Every aspect of life mirrored party values. By dominating every sphere of governance, the party maintained unbroken authority consistently. Soviet society revolved entirely around its directives. Power and influence flowed from the party centrally. The Politburo was the party's highest body. It directed all major political decisions. Members held ultimate authority across government. No law passed without their approval. Policy and strategy were determined collectively. Internal debates occurred behind closed doors. Consensus guided public announcements carefully. Decision-making remained centralized at the top. The Politburo controlled economic planning completely. 5-year plans were implemented under its oversight. Industrial priorities reflected their strategic objectives. Agricultural policies followed political directives strictly. Appointments to key positions required Politburo approval. Ministers, governors, and military leaders reported directly. Power flowed from this small inner circle. Influence depended on trust and loyalty. They directed the Red Army and security forces. Military actions reflected political as well as strategic goals. Internal threats were neutralized efficiently. External defense remained tightly coordinated centrally. The Politburo shaped ideology throughout society. Propaganda campaigns reflected their chosen narratives. Education reinforced approved doctrines faithfully. Culture and media promoted official viewpoints. Emergency decisions could bypass normal channels. Speed was often essential in crises. The body operated with near absolute discretion. Secrecy preserved authority and control. Conflict within the Politburo occurred occasionally. Factions competed for influence and policy direction. Purges sometimes removed dissenting members. Loyalty became paramount for survival. They interacted closely with Lenin and successors. Guidance reflected both vision and pragmatism. Leadership depended on political skill, not elections. Power was both personal and institutional. The Politburo influenced international diplomacy directly. Foreign treaties required their authorization. Relations reflected ideological and strategic priorities. Global engagement was highly controlled and cautious. Its authority reinforced the party's dominance. Every major decision flowed through this body. Soviet governance depended on its direction. The Politburo defined the USSR's political landscape by controlling policy, appointments, and ideology. The Politburo became the true center of power. Soviet citizens experienced its influence daily. Its decisions shaped the nation's destiny permanently. All major decisions flowed from Moscow directly. Local authorities implemented policies without deviation. Autonomy was minimal, control absolute. Centralized planning dominated every sector. Economic strategies were dictated from above. 5-year plans controlled industry and agriculture. Targets and quotas left little flexibility. Local managers followed strict instructions. Political decisions mirrored central priorities closely. Governors and ministers reported constantly upward. Loyalty was more important than innovation. Disobedience led to severe consequences immediately. Military and security policies were tightly coordinated. Red Army deployments followed central command. Border defenses were directed from Moscow. Internal policing ensured unified compliance everywhere. Centralized governance extended to education policies. Curricula reinforced party ideology consistently. Universities taught state-approved theories exclusively. Youth organizations trained future loyal citizens. Information control was essential to maintain authority. Media and propaganda reflected central narratives. Alternative viewpoints were censored rigorously. History and news were interpreted politically. Crisis management relied on rapid central decisions. Natural disasters or shortages required Moscow guidance. Regional officials had little discretion independently. Authority remained concentrated without compromise. Cultural production served centralized objectives strictly. Art, literature, and film aligned with ideology. Creative freedom existed only within party limits. Expression reflected political as well as social goals. Centralized decision-making reinforced the one-party state. It ensured uniformity across vast territories. Implementation depended on discipline and obedience. Deviation was considered subversive activity immediately. The system prioritized efficiency in control over flexibility. Planning dictated every sector of Soviet life. Society adapted to rules imposed centrally. Daily life reflected top-down governance continuously. By concentrating authority, the USSR maintained stability. Decision-making was swift but rigid and absolute. Power flowed through a carefully structured hierarchy. Centralized control defined the Soviet Union completely. Citizens lived under strict state supervision. Speech, press, and assembly were restricted. Criticism of government was considered dangerous. Freedom existed only on paper officially. Censorship controlled all written and spoken content. Newspapers, books, and radio reflected party ideology. Independent media outlets were quickly suppressed. Public opinion was guided carefully by authorities. Political opposition was outlawed completely. Non-Bolshevik parties were banned permanently. Participation in governance required party loyalty. Dissent was punished severely and immediately. KGB and secret police monitored citizens continuously. Suspicious behavior could result in imprisonment. Neighbors often reported each other for safety. Fear maintained compliance across society effectively. Religious practice faced strict limitations regularly. Churches were closed or repurposed frequently. Belief systems were subordinated to state ideology. Religion was portrayed as counter-revolutionary influence. Protests and demonstrations were suppressed swiftly. Strikes were forbidden without party approval. Workers could not organize independently legally. Labor rights existed only under state control. Education and culture reinforced ideological conformity. Textbooks taught loyalty and obedience exclusively. Art and literature promoted political orthodoxy. Youth organizations shaped attitudes from early age. Mobility and personal choice were restricted severely. Travel abroad required government authorization. Employment depended on political reliability largely. Every aspect of life reflected party oversight. Trials for alleged dissenters were often publicized. Confessions were coerced and widely disseminated. Fear discouraged independent thought widely. Legal rights were subordinate to political control. Limited freedoms ensured total political dominance. The state remained unchallenged across generations. Individual liberty was secondary to societal goals. Soviet citizens adapted to restricted reality. By curbing freedoms, the government maintained stability. Control permeated daily life and thought. Power was centralized and unchallenged effectively. The political system reflected absolute authoritarian rule. The Soviet Union created a fully planned economy. Central authorities decided production and distribution. Market forces were largely ignored entirely. State control guided every economic decision. Economic planning covered industry, agriculture, and trade. Factories followed strict production quotas. Workers were assigned jobs by officials. Local managers implemented top-down directives strictly. Resource allocation was determined centrally. Raw materials were distributed based on priorities. No enterprise acted independently without permission. Centralization replaced market competition completely. The government aimed to modernize quickly. Efficiency often conflicted with political objectives. Plans focused on heavy industry first. Consumer goods were considered secondary priorities. State banks managed investment and financing. Funds were directed to strategic projects. Loans and capital allocation followed central guidance. Economic growth depended entirely on government decisions. Prices and wages were fixed by authority. Supply and demand had minimal influence. Shortages and surpluses were common frequently. Bureaucracy attempted to solve inefficiencies systematically. Economic planning aimed to achieve ideological goals. Self-sufficiency was preferred over global trade. Industrial development symbolized socialist success. Progress validated the party's authority continuously. Education and labor policies supported the system. Workers were trained for planned tasks. Technical schools produced necessary skilled labor. Citizens learned to function within controlled economy. Planning required constant monitoring and adjustments. 5-year plans evaluated successes and failures. Policy could change to meet unforeseen needs. Flexibility was limited, but occasionally exercised. The planned economy transformed Soviet society dramatically. Traditional market structures disappeared almost entirely. Government direction defined opportunity and prosperity. Life revolved around state-determined priorities exclusively. The Soviet government introduced ambitious 5-year plans. They aimed to transform industry rapidly. Targets were strict and tightly monitored. Success was measured by production quotas. Heavy industry received the highest priority. Steel, coal, and machinery were emphasized. Consumer goods were often neglected intentionally. Infrastructure projects expanded across the nation. Urban centers grew with massive factories. New cities rose to house workers. Housing was often basic, but functional. Labor was organized according to plan requirements. Managers and officials reported progress daily. Failure to meet quotas led to punishment. Exceeding targets was rewarded with recognition. Propaganda celebrated industrial achievements widely. The plans relied on mobilizing the workforce. Men and women were assigned compulsory labor. Youth organizations contributed to national projects. Voluntary and forced labor supplemented official efforts. Transportation networks were expanded systematically. Railways, roads, and canals supported industry. Resources moved according to central directives. Logistics were crucial for planned success. Innovation was encouraged within strict limits. Technological advances were adapted rapidly to needs. Experimentation occurred, but remained tightly controlled. Practical results outweighed theoretical exploration consistently. International trade was limited, but strategic. Imports supported critical industrial development only. Exports were mainly heavy industry goods. Economic independence was a political objective. The 5-year plans reshaped the Soviet economy. They transformed Russia into an industrial power. Cities, factories, and infrastructure were expanded massively. Society adapted to new centralized priorities effectively. Soviet industry expanded at unprecedented speed. Factories rose across cities and towns. Heavy machinery and steel production soared. Urban landscapes transformed dramatically in years. Hydroelectric plants powered new industrial complexes. Electricity enabled machinery and factory expansion. Energy infrastructure supported nationwide industrialization. Modern technology reshaped production methods rapidly. Cities attracted millions from rural regions. Migration created labor for growing factories. Housing and services struggled to keep pace. Urban life became crowded and regulated strictly. Industrial workforce included men and women. Women joined factories in unprecedented numbers. Youth contributed to labor campaigns actively. Labor mobilization supported ambitious production targets. Production quotas were monitored continuously by officials. Failures were punished. Success was publicized. Propaganda glorified workers and achievements daily. Hero workers became national symbols. Heavy industry took precedence over consumer goods. Steel, coal, and machinery were prioritized heavily. Every sector aligned with central economic plans. Shortages of everyday items were common consistently. Transportation networks expanded to serve factories. Railways and canals carried resources efficiently. Raw materials moved quickly across vast territories. Logistics ensured production targets were achievable. The growth strengthened the Soviet economy fundamentally. It created new urban centers and industries. Technological and industrial capacity increased dramatically. Soviet power was built on industrial foundation. Rapid industrialization reshaped society profoundly. Labor, migration, and planning defined daily life. Cities symbolized national progress and power. The USSR became an industrial superpower effectively. The Soviet government enforced agricultural collectivization strictly. Individual farms were merged into collective enterprises. Peasants lost private land ownership completely. State controlled production and distribution tightly. Collective farms aimed to increase efficiency nationwide. Modern machinery replaced traditional farming methods. Labor was organized collectively for productivity. Output targets were set by central authorities. Resistance emerged among wealthier peasants, kulaks. Many resisted violently or refused cooperation. The government responded with repression immediately. Land, livestock, and property were confiscated forcibly. Food production suffered during initial transition. Crops were seized to supply cities. Famine spread in several regions severely. Millions faced hunger and malnutrition consistently. Propaganda promoted collectivization as a socialist duty. Success was portrayed as building the future. Peasants were pressured to accept state authority. Compliance became essential for survival and safety. Mechanization increased over time gradually. Tractors and harvesters replaced traditional tools. Collective farms integrated industrial techniques slowly. Agricultural science supported centralized farming objectives. The state controlled grain exports strategically. Surplus fed industrial workers in cities. Rural populations endured sacrifices for urban growth. Economic planning subordinated agriculture to industry. Education and political indoctrination accompanied reforms. Peasants were taught socialist agricultural ideals. Party officials supervised daily farm operations. Local councils reported progress to central authorities. Collectivization reshaped rural society completely. Individual farming disappeared almost entirely. Communal labor defined everyday life in villages. Traditional social structures were fundamentally altered. Though productivity improved over time, the human cost remained extraordinarily high. Famine, repression, and displacement affected millions. The state prioritized ideology over human welfare. Collectivization became a cornerstone of Soviet control. Agriculture was tightly linked to political objectives. The rural population adapted under pressure continuously. State authority dominated both land and life. Industrialization and collectivization caused immense suffering. Millions faced famine, disease, and harsh conditions. Workers and peasants endured grueling daily labor. Life was strictly controlled by the state. Purges eliminated perceived political threats systematically. Party officials and ordinary citizens suffered arrests. Executions and imprisonment became widespread realities. Fear pervaded every level of society. Urban migration led to overcrowded living conditions. Housing was scarce, sanitation often inadequate. Families lived in cramped communal apartments. Basic necessities were rationed unevenly frequently. Forced labor camps held millions of prisoners. Gulags became a central instrument of control. Prisoners worked under brutal conditions constantly. Death rates were alarmingly high consistently. Famine struck rural populations repeatedly. Grain requisitions left villages starving. Children and elderly were particularly vulnerable. Hunger became a daily struggle for survival. Education and culture were tightly regulated. Creative freedom was sacrificed for political conformity. Writers, artists, and intellectuals faced censorship. Dissenting ideas could lead to exile. Family structures were disrupted by state policies. Parents worked long hours in factories or fields. Children were placed in state-run institutions frequently. Community life revolved around collective obligations. Public fear reinforced political obedience consistently. Neighbors reported each other for minor transgressions. Trust was replaced by caution and vigilance. Social bonds were weakened intentionally by authorities. The human cost extended beyond physical suffering. Psychological stress and trauma affected generations. Society adapted to constant surveillance and control. Individual aspirations were subordinated to state goals. Despite growth and modernization, sacrifices were immense. Industrial and agricultural progress carried a heavy price. Millions endured hardship to build socialist infrastructure. Economic and political achievements masked profound suffering. The social fabric of the USSR was deeply altered. Inequalities, fear, and repression shaped daily life. Communities adjusted to rigid state priorities continuously. Human cost remained a lasting historical legacy. By understanding these consequences, we see the price of rapid transformation. Economic power was achieved at enormous cost. Soviet progress was inseparable from human suffering. The Red Army was formed after revolution. It replaced the disbanded imperial military completely. Workers and peasants became its backbone. Loyalty to the Bolsheviks was essential. The army emphasized political indoctrination alongside training. Political commissars monitored soldiers continuously. Ideological commitment was as important as skill. Party loyalty ensured obedience during combat. Organization was structured and hierarchical strictly. Units reported to centralized command directly. Strategy and tactics were controlled from Moscow. Decisions were enforced without delay consistently. Training programs developed discipline and efficiency. Technical skills and political education combined. Military schools produced future commanders carefully. Preparation focused on defending the Soviet state. The Red Army grew rapidly in size. Millions of recruits joined during civil conflicts. Industrial workers and peasants became soldiers. Military mobilization supported both defense and control. Weapons production was centralized and prioritized heavily. Factories supplied rifles, artillery, and ammunition. Industrial capacity was aligned with military objectives. Logistics became a key component of readiness. Leadership emphasized both strategy and ideology. Lenin and later commanders guided overall operations. Decision-making reflected political and military goals. Discipline maintained coherence among massive forces. The Red Army proved crucial during the Civil War. It defeated white opposition efficiently. Military strength became a cornerstone of Bolshevik power. The army symbolized the revolutionary state's authority. Propaganda glorified the Red Army's achievements. Heroic narratives inspired recruitment and loyalty. Soldiers became symbols of socialist determination. Public support strengthened the military institution. The creation of the Red Army ensured survival. It was a tool of both war and politics. Its structure set the stage for future conflicts. The USSR's military foundation was firmly established. The Soviet Union faced devastating losses early. Nazi invasion in 1941 shocked the nation. Cities, towns, and villages were destroyed. Civilians endured violence, starvation, and terror. Millions of soldiers died defending their homeland. The Red Army suffered catastrophic casualties. Front lines shifted violently across Eastern Europe. Survival depended on extraordinary resilience and sacrifice. Urban centers were bombed relentlessly by the enemy. Factories and infrastructure were targeted strategically. Production slowed due to destruction and chaos. Rebuilding required immense effort and coordination. Civilians were mobilized to support the war. Women worked in factories and fields tirelessly. Children contributed to defense and agriculture actively. Entire society became part of the war effort. The siege of Leningrad lasted years brutally. Starvation and cold claimed countless lives. Daily survival became the central struggle. Hope persisted despite unimaginable hardship consistently. The Battle of Stalingrad inflicted tremendous losses. Both soldiers and civilians endured extreme suffering. Urban combat destroyed neighborhoods completely. Victory came at enormous human cost. Supply shortages plagued both military and civilians. Food, medicine, and equipment were insufficient. Rationing became a part of everyday life. Necessity forced innovation and extreme endurance continually. Mass graves and destruction marked conquered areas. Death tolls were staggering and widespread. Losses affected morale but strengthened determination. Survival became intertwined with patriotic duty. Psychological trauma affected soldiers and civilians alike. Grief, fear, and exhaustion were constant companions. Families lost multiple generations of men. Society was scarred by unimaginable suffering deeply. Despite catastrophic losses, Soviet resistance persisted. Coordination between army and civilians improved over time. Factories relocated eastward to preserve production. The nation endured, adapting under extreme conditions. The massive losses shaped Soviet identity profoundly. Resilience and sacrifice became central to national pride. Memories of suffering were honored and remembered. Victory was seen as both survival and triumph. The Red Army advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. Battles were fought with extraordinary determination. Soldiers endured harsh conditions continuously. Victory required courage, strategy, and sacrifice. Stalingrad marked a turning point decisively. Axis forces suffered catastrophic defeats. Momentum shifted to the Soviet side. Morale soared after months of struggle. Massive offensives liberated occupied territories quickly. Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics were freed. Cities were destroyed but slowly rebuilt. Liberation brought relief and renewed hope. Soviet logistics supported relentless operations efficiently. Supplies, reinforcements, and weapons flowed steadily. Coordination between fronts maximized military effectiveness. Central planning ensured sustained offensive momentum. Propaganda highlighted heroism of soldiers extensively. Victory became a symbol of Soviet strength. Civilians and soldiers celebrated national unity. Sacrifice was honored through monuments and ceremonies. The Battle of Kursk showcased strategic mastery. Tank and infantry units coordinated tightly. Technological innovation supported decisive outcomes. Soviet tactics evolved through experience and planning. Berlin fell in May 1945 finally. Red Army captured the city entirely. Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Soviets. Victory ended years of brutal conflict. Post-war reconstruction began immediately across cities. Factories, railways, and homes were rebuilt. Economic and social recovery took decades. The nation mourned losses while celebrating survival. Victory solidified Soviet political authority domestically. Communist parties' legitimacy grew immensely. Military heroism reinforced ideological power consistently. Leadership claimed credit for national survival. Soviet victory marked a new global status. It demonstrated military, industrial, and organizational strength. Eastern Europe entered Soviet sphere of influence. The USSR emerged as a dominant world power. After World War II, the USSR expanded rapidly. Red Army occupied much of Eastern Europe. Soviet influence replaced previous governments quickly. Communist regimes were established under Moscow. Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia fell under control. Political structures mirrored Soviet models strictly. Local parties followed directives from Moscow. Ideology shaped governance and daily life directly. Military presence ensured compliance with Soviet policies. Red Army bases maintained strategic oversight constantly. Resistance movements were suppressed firmly and swiftly. Security forces monitored civilian and political activity. Economic systems were centralized following Soviet plans. Industries were nationalized and production controlled centrally. Trade and resources flowed according to Moscow's priorities. Agriculture was collectivized to match Soviet policies. Propaganda promoted socialist ideals throughout the region. Education and culture reflected Soviet-approved narratives exclusively. Media reinforced ideological loyalty to the USSR. Public ceremonies celebrated socialist achievements and unity. Political purges removed potential opposition efficiently. Leaders resisting Soviet guidance were replaced immediately. Fear and loyalty ensured regime stability reliably. Dissent was suppressed systematically and ruthlessly. The Warsaw Pact formalized military alliances. Eastern European states became buffer zones strategically. Soviet influence extended through both diplomacy and force. Control balanced ideology with security considerations carefully. Economic reconstruction followed Soviet priorities exclusively. Infrastructure and industry were rebuilt under guidance. Political conformity ensured rapid adaptation to socialist systems. Development reinforced dependence on Moscow consistently. Expansion secured the USSR's western borders effectively. Neighboring countries remained politically aligned for decades. Eastern Europe became a Soviet-dominated geopolitical bloc. Influence extended through military, political, and economic control. By controlling Eastern Europe, the USSR projected power. It created a strategic buffer against the West. Soviet ideology spread across multiple nations rapidly. The region became central to Cold War dynamics. The USSR emerged as a global military superpower. Victory in World War II showcased immense strength. Its army was large, disciplined, and technologically advanced. Strategic planning emphasized defense and global influence. Nuclear weapons elevated Soviet power dramatically. The atomic bomb transformed geopolitical balance instantly. Military strategy combined conventional and nuclear capabilities. Soviet deterrence shaped international diplomacy continuously. The Red Army maintained vast territorial deployments. Eastern Europe remained under strict Soviet oversight. Bases and troops extended influence across the continent. Military readiness was a priority at all times. Technological advances in aviation and armor progressed rapidly. Tanks, aircraft, and missiles enhanced global status. Research and production focused on strategic superiority. Innovation became essential to maintain military dominance. The USSR led the Warsaw Pact alliance effectively. Allied nations' militaries were coordinated strategically. Soviet command influenced regional and global security. Collective defense reinforced Moscow's authoritative position. Cold War tensions required constant preparedness. Missile development and nuclear strategy dominated planning. Space exploration also served military prestige indirectly. Competitions with the United States drove innovation. Military parades displayed strength and instilled pride. Public ceremonies reinforced power and ideological dominance. Society revered soldiers as national heroes consistently. Propaganda celebrated technological and strategic achievements. Defense industry became a central economic priority. Factories, research institutes, and infrastructure focused on arms. Resources were allocated to sustain global influence. Industrial planning supported both civilian and military needs. By the 1950s, the USSR was undeniably powerful. It controlled vast military resources globally. Its presence shaped alliances, treaties, and conflicts. Military might define Soviet international standing permanently. Emergence as a superpower reshaped global politics. The world recognized Soviet strategic and ideological authority. Power projection became central to foreign policy. The USSR entered the Cold War with dominance securely. After World War II, tension grew rapidly. The USSR and United States became global rivals. Conflicting ideologies fueled mistrust and competition. Capitalism clashed directly with communist principles continually. Both powers sought political and military dominance. Europe and Asia became strategic areas of influence. Alliances were formed to counter opposing blocs. Global diplomacy reflected intense ideological competition constantly. Nuclear weapons increased stakes dramatically and dangerously. Deterrence dictated military planning for both nations. Propaganda emphasized each side's superiority relentlessly. Every technological and cultural achievement became political leverage. Espionage networks operated worldwide secretly and effectively. Intelligence gathering shaped strategy and international relations. Spy agencies monitored rival activities extensively. Information became a critical tool in the rivalry. Economic and technological competition drove rapid innovation. Space exploration symbolized national strength and ideology. Science, industry, and research became arenas of pride. Achievements were celebrated as national and ideological victories. Cultural influence extended beyond borders globally. Media, literature, and art promoted national values. Soft power became as important as military strength. Public perception was carefully shaped in both nations. Military alliances reinforced global positioning clearly. NATO emerged as a Western counterbalance. Warsaw Pact solidified Eastern Bloc defense strategies. Each side prepared for potential direct conflict. Diplomatic negotiations were cautious, yet tense continuously. Treaties aimed to limit confrontation and reduce escalation. Summits highlighted both cooperation and competition. Rivalry defined the international order for decades. Both nations influenced developing countries strategically. Aid, advisors, and military support were tools. Regional conflicts became arenas for indirect competition. Global politics revolved around ideological alignment and loyalty. The rivalry shaped domestic policies profoundly. Internal propaganda promoted vigilance and loyalty continuously. Education emphasized ideological superiority of each system. Society internalized competition as a national priority. The US-Soviet rivalry became the Cold War. It defined global politics for much of the 20th century. Ideology, power, and military might drove decisions. Tensions persisted without direct large-scale conflict successfully. After World War II, the USSR consolidated power. Eastern European nations came under Soviet influence. Communist governments were installed systematically and firmly. Moscow dictated political, economic, and military policies. Poland, East Germany, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia followed directives. Local leaders aligned with Soviet ideology completely. Opposition parties were banned immediately and permanently. Governance mirrored the USSR's centralized political model. The Warsaw Pact formalized military control regionally. Soviet troops remained stationed across these countries. Armed forces enforced compliance and deterred dissent. Military presence ensured loyalty to Moscow continually. Economies were integrated under Soviet-style central planning. Industrialization and collectivization followed Moscow's strategic priorities. Trade and resource distribution were centrally coordinated. Economic dependence strengthened political control permanently. Propaganda promoted socialist ideology throughout the bloc. Education, media, and culture reflected party objectives. Cultural conformity reinforced political loyalty consistently. Public ceremonies celebrated socialist achievements and Soviet leadership. Resistance movements existed, but were swiftly crushed. Secret police and intelligence agencies monitored dissent rigorously. Opposition was removed through imprisonment or execution. Fear ensured stability across the bloc effectively. The Eastern Bloc served as a strategic buffer. Soviet influence protected Western borders from potential threats. Nations acted as satellites to Moscow's directives continuously. Political alignment became mandatory for survival. Economic and social reconstruction followed Soviet guidance. Infrastructure, industry, and education were centralized rapidly. Soviet-style institutions replaced pre-war national structures. Daily life reflected Moscow's priorities and ideology. By 1949, the Eastern Bloc was firmly established. Soviet dominance over politics, economy, and society was absolute. Nations became both ideological and strategic extensions of the USSR. The bloc defined Europe's geopolitical landscape during the Cold War. The Cold War sparked an unprecedented arms race. The USSR and United States competed relentlessly. Nuclear weapons became the ultimate strategic deterrent. Both nations aimed for technological supremacy constantly. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. This achievement ended America's nuclear monopoly immediately. Global balance of power shifted dramatically overnight. Mutually assured destruction shaped military planning consistently. Missile development accelerated rapidly in both countries. ICBMs and strategic bombers became central priorities. Technology and engineering focused on delivering warheads efficiently. Defense planning revolved around potential nuclear conflict. Arms production dominated the Soviet economy heavily. Factories, research institutes, and laboratories expanded rapidly. Resources were allocated primarily to military development. Industrialization emphasized weapons alongside conventional goods. Civil defense measures were implemented nationwide actively. Bunkers, drills, and early warning systems were widespread. Population trained to respond to potential attacks. Psychological preparation became part of daily life. Space exploration served both prestige and military purposes. Satellites provided reconnaissance and communication advantages. Missiles and launch technology overlapped with defense programs. Scientific progress strengthened military and strategic capabilities. The arms race influenced international diplomacy heavily. Treaties like SALT and INF attempted to limit escalation. Negotiations balanced competition with caution continuously. Global strategy depended on nuclear deterrence credibility. Propaganda emphasized technological and military superiority constantly. Education highlighted scientific achievements and national pride. Public perception reinforced ideological confidence extensively. Competition became a symbol of national prestige. Both nations stockpiled vast arsenals strategically. Nuclear weapons created global tension without direct conflict. Strategic planning became central to Cold War policy. Military dominance defined geopolitical relationships worldwide. The arms race ensured that the USSR remained a superpower. Technological innovation and military preparedness reinforced influence globally. Soviet authority was recognized both regionally and internationally. Nuclear capability secured the USSR's strategic position permanently. During the Cold War, conflicts erupted globally. The USSR supported allies with weapons and advisors. Wars became arenas for ideological confrontation indirectly. Direct confrontation between superpowers was avoided strategically. Korea became the first major proxy conflict. North Korea received Soviet backing extensively. United Nations and US forces opposed communism. War ended with division, illustrating global tension. Vietnam became a prolonged and brutal struggle. Soviet support aided North Vietnamese forces heavily. Ideological commitment drove both sides persistently. Conflict symbolized the wider East-West competition. Afghanistan faced Soviet intervention in 1979. Red Army fought insurgents with international support. Proxy forces received backing from the United States. Decade-long conflict drained resources and morale deeply. Latin America saw Soviet influence in Cuba. Missile deployment triggered the Cuban Missile Crisis. Strategic confrontation nearly escalated into nuclear war. Global diplomacy was tested under extreme pressure. Africa experienced Cold War interventions frequently. Angola and Ethiopia received Soviet military aid. Civil wars were shaped by ideological alignment. Both superpowers attempted to expand influence covertly. Proxy wars spread Soviet ideology worldwide intentionally. Military advisors trained local forces in socialist methods. Economic aid accompanied arms and strategic support. Influence was exerted without direct territorial occupation. The conflicts showcased Soviet military and diplomatic reach. Influence extended to Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Superpower rivalry was played out globally, indirectly. Strategy balanced ideology with practical geopolitical goals. Human cost of proxy wars was immense constantly. Civilians and soldiers suffered from prolonged combat. Local economies were disrupted severely by conflict. Societies experienced instability and trauma repeatedly. Despite challenges, the USSR maintained global influence. Alliances and client states reflected strategic priorities. Military and ideological reach extended across continents. Proxy wars shaped the Cold War's geopolitical map permanently. The USSR promoted communism worldwide actively. Marxist-Leninist ideology guided political and social goals. Education and propaganda emphasized socialist principles constantly. Ideology shaped domestic and foreign policies consistently. Communist parties were supported globally strategically. Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America were influenced. Revolutionary movements received political, economic, and military aid. Soviet ideology aimed to challenge capitalist nations directly. Media and culture spread socialist ideas effectively. Newspapers, radio, and books reinforced party doctrine. Films and literature promoted workers' struggles heroically. Education instilled ideological loyalty from early age. Scientific and technological achievements were politicized extensively. Space exploration became a symbol of ideological superiority. Economic development highlighted socialist efficiency versus capitalism. Competitions with the West showcased system effectiveness publicly. Cultural exchanges promoted socialist values abroad. Artists, writers, and students engaged in ideological outreach. International organizations became platforms for promoting communism. Influence extended subtly beyond direct political control. Ideological confrontation influenced diplomacy worldwide continuously. Treaties, alliances, and negotiations reflected competing visions. Each superpower sought global recognition for its system. Soft power became central to international strategy. Youth movements reinforced ideology in the next generation. Komsomol and other organizations trained future leaders. Education emphasized socialist ethics and political loyalty. Cultural indoctrination ensured continuity of ideological influence. Propaganda framed the USSR as a global leader. Capitalism was depicted as exploitative and unstable. Socialist systems were presented as fair and progressive. Ideological superiority became a core national narrative. Competition affected developing nations profoundly. Aid, advisors, and military support shaped local politics. Alignment with socialism or capitalism determined economic and military support. Proxy influence extended ideology across continents consistently. By promoting socialism, the USSR projected power globally. Ideology became inseparable from strategy and military influence. Political, cultural, and economic efforts reinforced global standing. The Soviet Union defined itself as a model alternative internationally. The Soviet state controlled all media completely. Newspapers, radio, and television reflected ideology. Independent reporting was banned immediately and permanently. Propaganda reinforced party messages constantly and effectively. Education was centrally planned and strictly regulated. Curricula emphasized Marxist-Leninist principles exclusively. History, literature, and science followed party interpretations. Teachers were monitored and guided by officials. Schools promoted loyalty to the communist state. Youth organizations instilled obedience and political commitment. Extracurricular activities reinforced ideological education continuously. Children learned the importance of collective responsibility. Universities trained future party and technical elites. Higher education focused on producing skilled leaders. Science and engineering were aligned with state priorities. Innovation was encouraged, but within ideological boundaries. Media and education shaped public perception strategically. Information reinforced loyalty and discouraged dissent consistently. Art, literature, and culture reflected party objectives. Knowledge and creativity were subordinated to political goals. Propaganda campaigns were ubiquitous and persuasive. National achievements were glorified extensively in the media. Heroes of labor and war were celebrated publicly. Historical narratives emphasized communist progress and triumph. State-controlled publications influenced both urban and rural areas. Local newspapers echoed central directives faithfully. Radio broadcasts reached remote populations regularly. Television reinforced party ideology visually and emotionally. Teachers and journalists were party loyalists predominantly. Career advancement depended on ideological compliance consistently. Deviation from party lines risked dismissal or worse. Every professional in education and media served the state. Daily life revolved around education and information exposure. Children and adults consumed state-approved content repeatedly. Knowledge reinforced party-approved moral and political values. Learning and information shaped attitudes toward authority. By controlling media and education, the USSR ensured ideological conformity and social cohesion. Every citizen absorbed a consistent worldview from childhood. Information and knowledge became instruments of state power. Socialist realism dominated Soviet arts completely. Painting, literature, and music reflected ideology strictly. Artists portrayed heroic workers and revolutionary achievements. Creative expression served political and social goals. Literature glorified labor and collective progress continually. Novels emphasized moral duty to the state. Characters embodied socialist virtues and ideals consistently. Personal ambition was subordinated to communal success. Film depicted Soviet victories and ideological triumphs. Heroes overcame adversity through collective effort. Historical events were reinterpreted to support the party. Cinema reinforced values approved by the authorities. Architecture reflected functional and ideological priorities prominently. Monuments and public buildings celebrated socialist achievements. Urban planning incorporated political symbolism explicitly. Designs emphasized collective rather than individual identity. Music celebrated patriotism and revolutionary struggle extensively. Composers created works glorifying labor and heroism. Mass concerts reinforced cultural unity Under socialism, art became a tool of political education continuously. The state sponsored exhibitions and publications strategically. Works aligned with ideology received funding and recognition. Deviation from socialist realism was discouraged severely. Critics enforced conformity in cultural production strictly. Artistic training focused on party-approved techniques. Schools emphasized ideological content alongside skill development. Students learned to convey state values artistically. Creativity was molded by political and moral objectives. Socialist realism shaped national identity significantly. It promoted unity, loyalty, and shared purpose consistently. Cultural output reflected state priorities over individual expression. Society internalized ideals through constant exposure to art. By enforcing socialist realism, the USSR controlled culture. Art became both propaganda and moral guidance. Every creative field reinforced political and social order. Public perception was shaped by a unified cultural narrative. Religion was heavily restricted under Soviet rule. Churches and mosques were closed or repurposed. Clergy faced arrest or exile frequently. Faith was portrayed as counter-revolutionary influence constantly. Religious education was banned in schools strictly. Children learned secular, state-approved values exclusively. Traditional beliefs were discouraged in daily life. Party ideology replaced spiritual teachings entirely. Propaganda criticized religious practices persistently. Media portrayed religion as outdated and harmful. Festivals and rituals were suppressed systematically. Society was encouraged to adopt atheistic principles. State monitored religious communities rigorously and closely. Worshippers were observed by local authorities consistently. Public gatherings were restricted or infiltrated frequently. Religious leaders were pressured to conform or resign. Despite restrictions, private belief persisted quietly. Families continued practices within homes secretly. Cultural traditions survived in modified forms cautiously. Faith remained a personal, often hidden, identity. Religious institutions were stripped of property and influence. Monasteries and churches were converted to secular use. Land and assets were nationalized immediately. Community support structures were dismantled deliberately. Internationally, the USSR promoted atheism as progressive. Secularism was linked to modernity and socialist development. Religious freedom was framed as counterproductive globally. The state projected ideological control beyond its borders. Soviet holidays replaced religious celebrations systematically. Commemorations focused on labor, revolution, and military achievements. Cultural life reflected ideological rather than spiritual priorities. Rituals were politicized or eliminated entirely. Restrictions on religion reshaped society profoundly. Faith became private or underground practice predominantly. Churches remained symbols but lost public authority. Ideology replaced spiritual guidance in daily life. By controlling religion, the state strengthened political power. Citizens' beliefs were aligned with party doctrine increasingly. Traditional authority structures were subordinated to the government. Spiritual life was redefined under secular, ideological terms. The Soviet state provided widespread social welfare consistently. Healthcare, housing, and pensions were guaranteed formally. Access aimed to reduce inequality across society. Services reflected socialist principles of collective support. Education was free and compulsory for all children. Literacy campaigns targeted rural and urban populations. Universities and technical schools were state-funded entirely. Training aimed to develop skilled workers and leaders. Healthcare focused on prevention and treatment systematically. Hospitals and clinics were built in every region. Doctors and nurses were trained under state programs. Medical access was a right, not a privilege. Housing projects aimed to accommodate growing urban populations. Communal apartments and standardized buildings were common. Urban planning reflected collective living principles consistently. Private property was largely eliminated in cities. Welfare programs supported families, workers, and retirees. Subsidies, rations, and assistance were distributed officially. The state sought to provide four basic needs. Social services reinforced loyalty and dependence on government. Education emphasized science, technology, and ideology equally. Technical schools prepared students for industrial and agricultural roles. Political education instilled Marxist-Leninist principles continually. Learning reinforced the connection between citizenship and socialist duty. Cultural programs were part of social welfare systematically. Libraries, theaters, and clubs were widely accessible. Arts education promoted ideological and creative development. Participation reflected state priorities and collective engagement. Social mobility was tied to education and loyalty. Career advancement depended on party affiliation and skills. Merit and ideology determined opportunity consistently. The system rewarded conformity and competence strategically. Daily life was shaped by these services extensively. Citizens relied on state for survival and progress. Access to welfare created stability and social cohesion. Dependence strengthened both control and collective identity permanently. By providing social welfare and education, the USSR fostered loyalty and societal compliance effectively. Citizens' lives were structured around state institutions. Public services reinforced ideology and collective priorities continually. Every citizen lived under constant state observation. KGB and local authorities monitored daily activities. Neighbors reported suspicious behavior without hesitation. Fear maintained obedience and conformity effectively. Private conversations were rarely safe or secret. Informants listened and reported to authorities regularly. Trust was limited even among family and friends. Loyalty to the state was a survival necessity. Public spaces were monitored extensively with caution. Workplaces, schools, and community centers had observers. Suspicion was part of everyday interactions consistently. Deviation from norms risked interrogation, or worse. Surveillance extended to letters, phone calls, and media. Communication was scrutinized for political compliance constantly. Censorship reinforced monitoring and controlled information flow. Every message could be interpreted as subversive activity. Political loyalty dictated social and professional advancement. Career opportunities depended on ideological reliability consistently. Party membership was a shield against suspicion. Deviation threatened personal and familial security severely. Children learned caution and obedience from early years. Youth organizations monitored behavior and political alignment. Schools reinforced vigilance and loyalty to authorities. Ideology shaped daily thought and interactions subtly. Even cultural and recreational activities were observed. Clubs, theaters, and sporting events were monitored regularly. Attendance and participation reflected conformity to expectations. Deviant behavior was flagged and reported quickly. Fear and surveillance influenced mental health profoundly. Anxiety, distrust, and stress were widespread continuously. Citizens adapted by self-censoring thoughts and speech. Behavior was constantly aligned with state expectations. Surveillance created social control without constant force. Obedience became internalized through fear of observation. Power was reinforced through monitoring and reporting systems. Society functioned within invisible but strict boundaries. By living under surveillance, citizens shaped their lives. Autonomy was limited. Compliance ensured safety consistently. The state maintained control over thoughts and actions. Every aspect of life reflected monitoring and oversight. In 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik successfully. It was the first artificial satellite orbiting Earth. The world was shocked by Soviet technological achievement. Science and politics combined in spectacular display. Sputnik marked the beginning of the space age. The United States scrambled to catch up immediately. Global attention focused on Soviet innovation and progress. Propaganda portrayed the USSR as technologically superior. The satellite transmitted signals, detectable worldwide continuously. Radio waves were received by scientists and amateurs alike. This achievement demonstrated advanced engineering capabilities clearly. It validated the Soviet education and industrial system. Military applications of satellite technology were implied subtly. Surveillance and missile guidance potential raised strategic concerns. The launch symbolized both scientific and political power. Global strategy had to account for this capability. Soviet society celebrated Sputnik's success extensively. Schools, media, and organizations highlighted national pride. Youth were inspired to pursue science and engineering. Ideology and achievement were linked publicly and internally. Sputnik intensified the USSR rivalry significantly. It spurred the creation of NASA in response. Competition in science and technology became central globally. Space exploration became a key aspect of Cold War strategy. The launch demonstrated coordination of industry and research effectively. Factories, scientists, and engineers worked together efficiently. Central planning enabled rapid technological development successfully. The achievement reflected the state's organizational and scientific capacity. Sputnik symbolized Soviet ambition and modernity globally. It inspired confidence domestically and concern internationally. Technological prowess became a measure of ideological success. Space achievement was now intertwined with political identity. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth. He became the first human in space. The flight was a triumph of Soviet engineering. Global audiences marveled at this historic achievement. Gagarin's mission lasted just over 1 hour. The Vostok spacecraft completed a full orbit. He experienced weightlessness and returned safely. The mission proved humans could survive in space. Soviet scientists and engineers were celebrated nationally. Technical success boosted confidence in the space program. Propaganda emphasized the superiority of socialism. Achievement was framed as evidence of Soviet progress. Gagarin became a global celebrity immediately. He traveled internationally, promoting Soviet scientific achievements. His flight inspired a generation of scientists and pilots. Space exploration was linked to national pride permanently. The mission accelerated the space race with the United States. American programs intensified to compete technologically. Competition in space became central to Cold War strategy. Every launch symbolized ideological and political strength. Soviet society hailed Gagarin as a hero. Parades, ceremonies, and awards reinforced national pride. Schools taught about his achievement extensively. Youth were encouraged to pursue science careers ambitiously. Flight demonstrated coordination between technology and human skill. Engineering, training, and planning ensured mission success. Every stage of the mission was meticulously calculated. Human and technical factors were equally important for safety. Gagarin's mission symbolized the USSR's global prestige. It showed capability to lead in science and technology. International perception of Soviet power and innovation increased. Space achievement became a tool of soft power. This historic flight strengthened Soviet ideological narrative. It validated planning, education, and industrial organization effectively. Human exploration of space became a symbol of socialism. The USSR's status as a scientific superpower was cemented. The Soviet Union prioritized science and engineering heavily. Research focused on aerospace, physics, and technology. Institutes trained specialists in industry and defense. Innovation was tied to ideological and strategic goals. Industrial design emphasized efficiency and mass production. Factories produced complex machinery for civilian and military use. Engineering advances supported urbanization and infrastructure growth. Projects reflected central planning and technical expertise. Space exploration drove breakthroughs in materials and propulsion. Rocket technology advanced rapidly under state programs. Satellites, launch vehicles, and human spaceflight were prioritized. Scientific achievements reinforced political prestige internationally. Medical and biological sciences received substantial investment. Hospitals and research centers improved public health knowledge. Vaccines, treatments, and surgical techniques were developed. Science served both civilian welfare and national goals. Nuclear physics advanced under military and energy programs. Power plants and research reactors expanded energy capacity. Weapon development relied on nuclear technology extensively. Dual-use research strengthened both defense and industry. Computing and telecommunications developed under centralized planning. Early computers supported military, scientific, and economic needs. Telegraph, radio, and satellite networks expanded communications. Engineering solutions were implemented systematically across sectors. Education promoted scientific literacy and technical skill nationwide. Universities emphasized applied sciences and industrial research. Students were trained to contribute directly to state projects. Knowledge production was tightly linked to national objectives. International collaboration highlighted achievements selectively. Soviet scientists shared innovations within friendly socialist nations. Exported technology reinforced global influence subtly. Alliances strengthened through scientific and technical exchange. Every sector integrated science into practical application. Agriculture, industry, and military benefited from research. Innovation became a tool for both prestige and power. Scientific progress reinforced ideological and geopolitical strength continually. The USSR became a global leader in technology. Industrial, military, and space accomplishments showcased systemic capability. Engineering achievements symbolized the strength of socialism. Science and innovation were inseparable from Soviet identity permanently. The Soviet Union advanced military technology rapidly. Tanks, aircraft, and missiles were developed continually. Weapons programs supported both defense and strategic goals. Industrial capacity prioritized military production consistently. Nuclear and conventional arsenals strengthened global influence. Missile systems extended reach across continents effectively. Submarines and bombers enhanced deterrence capabilities. Defense readiness was a national priority continuously. Civilian technology also progressed under state planning. Transportation networks expanded with trains and buses. Energy infrastructure grew with hydroelectric and nuclear power. Factories produced machinery for domestic and export use. Space technology benefited both military and civilian sectors. Satellites provided communication, observation, and navigation advantages. Rocket programs advanced scientific research and defense applications. Space achievements reinforced industrial and technological credibility. Electronics and computing supported military and economic objectives. Early computers managed data for planning and logistics. Telecommunications expanded nationwide under central oversight. Technology was integrated systematically across all sectors. Research institutions collaborated closely with industrial production. Innovation was applied quickly to practical challenges. Defense requirements influenced civilian technological development. Dual-use technology enhanced both society and military capability. Public projects highlighted technological progress nationally. Bridges, factories, and transportation hubs showcased engineering skill. Achievements were celebrated as evidence of socialist efficiency. Civilian infrastructure reinforced both economy and national pride. Training programs produced skilled engineers and technicians. Universities focused on applied sciences and practical innovation. Technical expertise supported rapid industrial and military growth. Human capital was central to technological development continuously. Military parades displayed cutting-edge equipment publicly. Weapons and vehicles became symbols of national strength. Technological achievement reinforced ideological and global authority. Society viewed innovation as a measure of progress consistently. By combining military and civilian technology, the USSR demonstrated systemic capability and efficiency. Industrial and scientific strength reinforced global superpower status. Technology became both a strategic and ideological instrument permanently. Space achievements symbolized Soviet ideological superiority clearly. Sputnik and Gagarin inspired global admiration and awe. Science and technology reflected the strength of socialism. Every success was framed as political and ideological victory. The space race became a proxy for global competition. Western nations measured themselves against Soviet accomplishments constantly. Education, industry, and research were highlighted nationally. Achievements reinforced the narrative of a progressive, modern state. Propaganda celebrated scientific triumphs widely and consistently. Media portrayed astronauts and engineers as socialist heroes. Monuments and stamps commemorated major space milestones permanently. Art and literature reinforced the ideological significance of progress. International exhibitions showcased Soviet technology prominently. Foreign audiences saw achievements as evidence of socialism. Competitions with the United States symbolized ideological confrontation. Every launch or scientific breakthrough was politically charged. Space success validated central planning and industrial organization. Education, training, and scientific coordination were glorified. Innovation and collective effort were tied to national identity. The USSR projected itself as a model for other nations. Youth programs emphasized participation in scientific advancement. Students were encouraged to emulate engineers and astronauts. Education and ideology were intertwined to promote loyalty. The next generation became invested in ideological and technical goals. Scientific conferences and publications reinforced ideological messaging globally. Soviet achievements were highlighted as superior to capitalism. Allied nations were encouraged to adopt socialist methods. Knowledge and progress became a tool of influence. Technological accomplishments strengthened domestic morale extensively. Citizens took pride in national and ideological achievements. Public celebrations reinforced faith in socialism's effectiveness. Every space mission reinforced belief in the state's power. Symbolically, space achievements were more than science. They represented the ideological struggle of the Cold War. Science and exploration were inseparable from political competition. The USSR used progress to define itself globally permanently. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy slowed. Growth rates declined across industry and agriculture. Centralized planning became increasingly inefficient and rigid. Shortages of goods frustrated citizens continually. Factories produced outdated machinery and limited products. Technological innovation lagged behind Western nations. Energy and raw material exploitation was mismanaged consistently. Economic output could not sustain population demands effectively. Agriculture suffered from poor planning and collectivization. Crop yields stagnated despite state intervention. Fertilizers, equipment, and labor were often insufficient. Food shortages became common in urban and rural areas. Heavy industry remained prioritized over consumer goods. Living standards lagged behind expectations and propaganda. Housing, clothing, and food were often rationed. Public dissatisfaction grew quietly but steadily. The arms race further strained resources continuously. Military spending consumed significant industrial and financial capacity. Consumer welfare was sacrificed for strategic and ideological priorities. Economic imbalance weakened the domestic economy significantly. Infrastructure deteriorated due to lack of maintenance. Transportation, utilities, and factories fell into disrepair. Efficiency losses compounded economic stagnation continually. Planning rigidity prevented timely adaptation or innovation. Technological backwardness hindered both civilian and military sectors. Computing, electronics, and industrial machinery lagged behind. Competitiveness with Western economies declined steadily. Global perception of Soviet efficiency was undermined consistently. Corruption and bureaucracy exacerbated stagnation significantly. Resources were misallocated, and incentives were misaligned. Party officials often prioritized personal gain over efficiency. Decision-making slowed economic responsiveness dramatically. Stagnation led to widespread dissatisfaction subtly. Public faith in the state's economic promises declined. Informal markets and black markets emerged frequently. Citizens sought alternatives to state-controlled supply systems. Economic stagnation undermined confidence in socialist ideology. The system struggled to meet expectations domestically and internationally. Calls for reform and innovation began to surface gradually. Structural weaknesses made the USSR increasingly vulnerable politically. Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985. He introduced reforms to revitalize the economy. Perestroika aimed to restructure industry and planning. Glasnost promoted openness and transparency across society. Economic reforms encouraged limited market mechanisms cautiously. Enterprises gained autonomy over production decisions partially. Profit incentives were introduced within socialist frameworks. State control was reduced slightly to improve efficiency. Political reforms allowed greater public participation gradually. Elections were expanded and criticism tolerated more openly. The Communist Party's monopoly was challenged subtly. New voices entered public discourse cautiously and carefully. Gorbachev sought to reduce bureaucracy and corruption. Administrative structures were streamlined for faster decision-making. Local authorities were given more responsibilities responsibly. Central oversight remained, but flexibility increased modestly. Social reforms addressed issues of inequality and stagnation. Housing, healthcare, and education policies were reviewed. Wages and labor conditions were improved incrementally. Citizen expectations were raised alongside state promises carefully. Foreign policy was adjusted for peaceful coexistence strategically. Relations with the West improved through diplomacy steadily. Arms reduction agreements were signed and implemented. International credibility of the USSR was partially restored gradually. Reforms faced resistance from Conservative Party members. Hardliners feared loss of control and ideological dilution. Internal opposition slowed implementation and created tensions continuously. Balancing reform and stability became increasingly challenging politically. Gorbachev's reforms aimed to modernize and sustain socialism. They reflected recognition of systemic weaknesses and global realities. Economic, political, and social strategies were intertwined intentionally. Efforts sought revival without abandoning core ideological principles entirely. By the late 1980s, reform impacts were visible partially. Some sectors improved efficiency and productivity modestly. Public discussion increased significantly compared to prior decades. Society became more aware of systemic problems openly. Gorbachev's leadership marked a shift from rigid control. Openness and restructuring redefined Soviet governance gradually. Policies signaled willingness to adapt to modern challenges. However, reforms also unleashed forces beyond immediate control. Glasnost promoted transparency and freedom of speech. Citizens could discuss politics more openly cautiously. Media exposed corruption, inefficiency, and social problems. Public criticism of governments increased dramatically and visibly. Perestroika aimed to restructure the economy effectively. Enterprises gained partial independence to improve output. Market mechanisms and incentives were introduced cautiously. Central planning was adjusted but remained influential moderately. Glasnost allowed historical and political debates to emerge. Previously forbidden topics, like Stalinism, were openly discussed. Society became aware of past abuses and failures. Public opinion influenced reforms and governance subtly. Perestroika encouraged foreign investment and joint ventures. International trade agreements expanded cautiously and selectively. Technology transfer and industrial modernization were promoted. Economic openness complemented political liberalization gradually. Glasnost led to a proliferation of independent media. Newspapers, radio, and television challenged state narratives. Art, literature, and film explored previously restricted themes. Cultural expression reflected broader societal change increasingly. Perestroika reforms faced bureaucratic and regional resistance. Managers and local officials resisted changes to authority. Implementation varied across industries and republics significantly. Economic outcomes were inconsistent and uneven nationally. Glasnost fostered political pluralism partially. Public discussion influenced local and national elections gradually. Opposition groups gained recognition within legal frameworks. Democratic institutions began to emerge cautiously in practice. The policies exposed systemic weaknesses in the USSR. Economic inefficiencies, corruption, and ethnic tensions became apparent. Societal expectations exceeded state capacity to reform quickly. Pressure for a change grew stronger than reforms could contain. Glasnost and Perestroika reshaped Soviet society fundamentally. Freedom of expression, political debate, and economic flexibility increased. However, reforms destabilized centralized control and unity gradually. The policies accelerated both modernization and systemic vulnerability simultaneously. By the late 1980s, nationalism surged in republics. Ethnic groups demanded greater autonomy and independence. Central authority weakened as local identities strengthened continuously. Long-suppressed cultural and political aspirations resurfaced strongly. Baltic states were among the first to push. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia sought sovereignty openly. Mass demonstrations and rallies challenged Soviet control directly. Public sentiment increasingly favored self-determination over unity. In the Caucasus, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan resisted central power. Ethnic tensions and historical grievances fueled unrest. Local governments demanded recognition and autonomy vigorously. Conflict between communities and Moscow escalated gradually. Central Asia experienced rising demands for cultural and political rights. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and others asserted ethnic and language pride. Grassroots movements demanded greater influence in governance. Nationalist sentiment grew faster than central reforms could manage. The Russian Republic itself faced internal regional pressures. Autonomy movements in Tatarstan and Chechnya emerged. Central authorities struggled to maintain cohesion effectively. Demands for decentralization challenged traditional Soviet control persistently. Gorbachev's reforms unintentionally empowered nationalist movements. Glasnost allowed open discussion of independence and identity. Perestroika weakened mechanisms of central economic and political control. Reforms accelerated disintegration instead of stabilizing authority. Mass protests, strikes, and political mobilization became common. Republics held elections, reflecting nationalist aspirations increasingly. Party loyalty was no longer sufficient to secure control. Local leaders gained power independent of Moscow's directives. Nationalist movements transformed political dynamics irreversibly. Unity under Soviet ideology eroded rapidly across regions. Ethnic and cultural identity became a rallying point. Central authority lost legitimacy in multiple republics simultaneously. By 1990, separatist movements dominated the political landscape. Independence declarations challenged Moscow's authority openly. Negotiations often failed to prevent confrontation effectively. The Soviet Union's cohesion was collapsing from within steadily. Nationalism became a key driver of the USSR's decline. Ethnic and regional identity overpowered loyalty to the state. Political fragmentation accelerated as reforms loosened central control. The rise of nationalist movements paved the way for dissolution permanently. By 1991, the USSR faced unstoppable internal crises. Economic stagnation, political reforms, and nationalism collided. Republics declared independence one after another rapidly. Central authority in Moscow weakened drastically and visibly. Gorbachev struggled to maintain unity and control. Coup attempts in August failed, but weakened his position. Public protests and strikes escalated across major cities. Support for central government collapsed almost entirely nationwide. The Baltic states formalized independence with international recognition. Other republics followed, asserting sovereignty and legal separation. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus led the formal dissolution process. Agreements divided assets, military forces, and governance responsibilities clearly. The Communist Party lost monopoly on power completely. Political structures of the Soviet states were dismantled. Institutions of central governance ceased functioning effectively. Reform efforts could no longer sustain unity politically. Economic collapse accelerated as republics took control locally. Currency, trade, and industrial management became decentralized quickly. State-run enterprises faced uncertainty and disruption immediately. Inflation and shortages increased social tensions substantially. Internationally, the USSR ceased to exist formally. December 25, 1991, marked Gorbachev's resignation officially. 15 independent nations emerged from former Soviet territory. Global balance of power shifted dramatically after the collapse. The dissolution ended decades of centralized ideology and control. Political, social, and economic structures were redefined regionally. Citizens experienced sudden changes in governance and daily life. Former Soviet republics pursued independent paths cautiously and gradually. Legacy of the USSR influenced post-Soviet states persistently. Borders, economies, and political institutions were reshaped permanently. Memory of Soviet power affected domestic and international policies. The collapse marked the definitive end of a superpower era. Economic, political, and social fragmentation became immediate challenges. Transition to new systems was chaotic and complex. Former republics sought stability, identity, and global integration. Recovery varied widely across regions over subsequent years. The Soviet Union's dissolution shaped global geopolitics forever. Cold War ended as the ideological and military rivalry ceased. Emergence of independent states altered international alliances permanently. History remembered the USSR as a superpower that once dominated globally. The Soviet Union left an indelible mark globally. Its existence reshaped the post-war world order. Borders, alliances, and conflicts were deeply influenced. Geopolitics today still reflects Soviet-era decisions profoundly. Its ideology inspired socialist movements worldwide passionately. Revolutionary ideas spread across continents strategically. Parties and governments adopted elements of socialism. Workers' rights and state-led economies gained prominence. Eastern Europe was transformed under Soviet guidance. Communist governments reshaped politics, society, and economy. Urban landscapes, industries, and education reflected Soviet models. Even after collapse, cultural and institutional remnants persist. Russia and former republics still feel Soviet influence. Politics, economy, and national identity were molded historically. Challenges of transition highlight the depth of prior systems. Memory of the USSR affects policy and public consciousness. Its achievements in science, space, and military were monumental. Technological progress became a symbol of ideological competition. Spaceflight, nuclear development, and industrialization showcased capability. Global perception of superpower status was earned and remembered. The USSR's collapse did not erase its historical impact. Borders, conflicts, and alliances continue to reflect its legacy. Former republics navigate the tension of independence and heritage. Societies reconcile Soviet history with new political realities. Internationally, the Cold War defined decades of tension. Nations aligned with or against its ideology strategically. Economic systems were challenged and compared to socialism. Global diplomacy was reshaped around ideological rivalry. The Soviet model influenced education, culture, and governance deeply. Art, literature, and media were vehicles of ideology. State control and central planning affected everyday life. Legacy persists in societal structures and collective memory. Economic, military, and scientific achievements inspire reflection today. Industrialization, space exploration, and defense capabilities remain impressive. The USSR demonstrated the power of centralized planning efficiently. Global influence was projected through both soft and hard power. Even in decline, its lessons shaped reform and resilience. Gorbachev's reforms revealed strengths and weaknesses simultaneously. Economic stagnation and political decentralization influenced successors. Collapse provided insights into governance, ideology, and societal dynamics. The Soviet Union remains one of history's most influential states. Its century-long journey shaped nations, ideologies, and cultures. The world continues to study, debate, and learn from it. Its legacy endures in geopolitics, memory, and global consciousness.